Do I share my screen now or wait for you?
I'll wait for me, please. Okay, so we're now streaming to LiveTube, so we're going to get started. Good morning to everyone out there. Good morning to the folks in the Americas, or at least North America, or the United States. Good afternoon to those of you in other parts of the world, or good evening. Glad to have you. Thanks for joining us for another FIND seminar. My name is Lauren Hayes. I'm one of the co-hosts of FIND with Carsten Schraden and Eduardo Fernandez Duque. And again, it's been a pleasure to have all of you coming on Tuesdays. I have to speak, honestly, I've been really enjoying this, and thanks again for being here. Before I introduce our speaker today, I wanted to make a couple of announcements. First off, again, let's thank Peter Kapler for a wonderful seminar last week. It was really invigorating, and I truly enjoyed it. And thanks to all the previous speakers too. Hopefully we'll continue having fun with this. And second of all, and this is actually a really fun announcement for me to make because the dude I'm going to be talking about has no idea that I'm going to do this. We have some exciting news about one of our co-hosts. And Eduardo, you can thank your son for this. Eduardo Fernandez Duque has been awarded a prestigious award by the American Association for Advancement of Science. It's the John P. McGovern Award Lecture, and it allows for outstanding behavioral scientists from around the world to present at the national meeting, I believe. And I took a look at the list. It's a pretty accomplished group of people. And the one name that popped out of me of someone who got this previously was Robert Sapolsky. So I think that this is a big deal, and it really gives me quite an honor to be working with Eduardo. It's been a wonderful working experience with him, and he really brings a lot to the table, and it's an amazing award. So let's give a big virtual congratulations to our friend and colleague Eduardo for his accomplishment.
Thanks. I'm hoping to bring behavioral ecology. I'm getting the impression that they are not thinking of behavioral sciences the way most of us think about it. So I really hope that we'll take the opportunity to bring our discipline of behavioral ecology to the ears and to the views of others.
Awesome. So a couple of additional updates after that great news. The three of us have been working diligently and hard trying to get the seminar going for the spring. As you know, we mentioned last time, I believe we're going to be holding some workshops in the January and February, but the seminar will start up again the first week of March. And we've already lined up 15 speakers with a couple of slots left. It's a pretty exciting group. We have talks coming in on, of course, mammals, birds, insects, but now we also have social amoeba, a talk on social amoeba, and some names of people that are going to be talking. It's not a complete list, but Tim Clinton-Brock will be, Joan Strassman, Nancy Solomon, and I'm blanking on other names, Joe Carter on vampire bats. So we'll have a really great group next spring. And we're really excited about this because we want this seminar to continue into the future. And so hopefully many of you in the audience will be coming for you and eventually, hopefully, and you'll be wanting to present for us because we really want to hear what you have to say about your research. And of course, if you have ideas, please make recommendations to one of the three of us. We're happy to take suggestions. Next week, we have Christina Riel, who is at Princeton University. She'll be talking about cooperation in birds. Looking forward to that. I've read some of her work recently, and it's quite excellent. So I hope many of you can come for that. In terms of the FIND seminar today, just in terms of structure, the seminar will be about 50 or so minutes. We then have about an hour of discussion, and I ask that during the seminar, you please make sure you're on mute so that the camera doesn't go to you if you move or something. And also that when we do the question and answer session or the discussion after Dan's talk, I'll be moderating that. And if you have a question, please just type a question mark into the chat. And if you're on YouTube, we have someone monitoring that. Please enter your question and then they'll relay it to me and I'll get it to Dan. So that brings me to today's speaker. And I have to say, I'm really happy to introduce my colleague and friend, Dan Blumstein from UCLA. Really thrilled that Dan could be here with us today. I've known Dan since probably the mid-2000s. And Dan's got quite an impressive resume, as all of you probably know. It was a real challenge to try and summarize it. I almost just thought of just throwing his website up there and letting you look at it, but I wanted to say some things. Dan got his PhD at UC Davis in the area of animal behavior, and clearly he's come out as a leader in that field. He's currently a full professor at the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology and Institute of Environment and Sustainability at UCLA. And if I had to summarize his research experience, or his interest and his productivity, I'd say it's diverse. It's focused and diverse at the same time. He's interested in a range of things from the evolution of social behavior. He dives into population biology and his long-term study of marmots at Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory. Interest in alarm calls and anti-predator behaviors. And all of this, he helps, the information he generates, which is really remarkable, he helps to inform conservation biology, which I think is really, really exciting. From my perspective, what really I'm particularly impressed by, I'm impressed by all of it, but the thing is he's maintained this long-term study site that Ken Armitage started, I believe, in the 1960s. It's up to over 50 years of data on the yellow-bellied marmots and RMBL. A really remarkable, sustained long-term study. He's generated over 300 publications, and I did a quick count, 27 as of 2020, in 2020, so really impressive. And people are citing him. He has an I-10 index of 300 with over 25,000 citations, according to Google Scholar. Gets lots of funding, NSF, NIH, National Geographic Society, and it also looked like some money coming from the Australian government for his work that he's done there. And he's really dynamic in his interests. I learned that early on when I met him. He's got numerous books out. The most recent is The Nature of Fear. I'll let him put it up there. Currently on the market. But he also has books that delve into conservation behavior, escape behavior, ecotourism, and he even has a cookbook. Okay, so pretty dynamic. Editorial work ranged from journals for animal behavior, ethology. If you're going to do a book review, you might hear from Dan, Quarterly Review of Biology. So he's a really dedicated editor and contributor to service to our field. He's won numerous awards, including the Animal Behavior Society's Quest Award. And he's done a remarkable job at training students. He has about 12 PhD, postdoc, master's level people in his lab now. And remarkably has two mascots, including Robo Badger. And he has numerous alumni from his lab. So his training is spread around the world. I counted about 24 grad level folks, and then there's numerous undergrads that I can't count. And he also has done a lot, as I said, to use his work to inform conservation, through his research and through his outreach, including writing children's books. And he also served on a White House panel on the environmental education. So really remarkable coverage across all three of the major areas of professional life in academia. And from a personal point of view, I'll just say, I worked with Dan on a couple of projects, including an international conference in Chile, and it was a blast to work with him. I was a junior at the time. I was an assistant professor, and I was working with Dan, and we were writing a grant together, and the learning experience that I had was remarkable. And I credit that to some of the skills that I've developed over the years. So, and the last thing is, if you get a chance to talk to Dan, you'll know that he has a breadth of topics that he can talk about with an intellectual and sort of a passion that's both within science and outside of science. And so today, we're really happy to have Dan present his talk. The title is Insights from an Emergent View of Sociality. So Dan, if you want to share your screen, again, please make sure you're on mute. Everyone else is on mute from now until the end of the talk. Thank you.
Can everyone see my screen? Lauren, if you can see it? Okay, great. Thank you so much. That was an amazing introduction. Took a while. But you know, what I want to do today is, and I have to say that, you know, this sucks. Let's just admit it. This is an amazing seminar series. And wouldn't this be more amazing if everyone coming to these could just sort of hang out and brush shoulders and talk after talks and hang out together. And I hope that this will continue on until, you know, we can do this live in person and meet each other. Because the diversity of people and backgrounds and expertise levels and post-research foci is so stimulating of the people that are coming and speaking here. It's an honor to be part of this. Today I want to talk about something that I just sort of looked at who's here, and several of you have already heard this, so you can leave now. Otherwise, I want to sort of address something that I've been thinking about and trying to wrap together a lot of work we've been doing with marmots, which is really thinking about what I'll call an emergent view of sociality. And it really starts with, you know, why be social? I mean, who wants to share? Clearly not Americans. You know, who wants to, you know, you get diseases if you hang out with others. We all know that now. You know, why share, risk getting diseases? Why, you know, cooperate? And how do we understand that? And a lot of us are interested in these questions. And, you know, this is sort of something that stimulates a lot of us to study the various systems we study. I want to just sort of give acknowledgments at the beginning. The yellow-bellied marmots at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab have studied since 1962. Ken Armitage, who is now 95, started the project and then graciously turned it over to me in 2001. The idea of an intergenerational transfer of a project is these long-term projects is kind of rare. Not all of them make it. You know, he continues to be sort of an insight. I work closely with Julian Martineau, who's based at the University of Ottawa. He's an amazing evolutionary geneticist. And then a variety of graduate students and postdocs, Dana, Raquel, Jen Smith, Adriana, Gabby, Tina, Arpat, Ozgul, Lucretia, Amanda, Anita, Holly Fuong, undergraduates as well, have been part of the story that I'm going to be telling today. But we use this long-term study really as a capacity building exercise where we train lots of people, undergraduates at UCLA, undergraduate REU students coming from all over the place, people coming from all over the place to work with us. We have a lot of data, and my attitude is if you got a good question and you want to work with us, talk to me, because data are there to be used and shared, not to be, you know, capped. And we're doing a lot of projects now, but there's always opportunities for creating new collaborations. And so with that, I'm going to sort of talk briefly about, you know, what I want to talk about today. Put on your seatbelts. I'll talk fast. I want to introduce the yellow-bellied marmot system. I want to talk about, you know, maybe some more traditional drivers of social variation. And then I really want to get down into thinking about using social network statistics to develop what I'll call an emergent attribute-driven view of sociality. Now, marmots have a, you know, an important part in our culture. If you're in a place that needs a midwinter festival like Northern Europe, you know, people are looking for something in February that sort of says spring's coming. And when the people from Northern Europe, Germany, came to Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Deutsch, what we call the Pennsylvania Dutch, you know, they sort of brought a tradition that really goes back to a pagan holiday that then became a Catholic holiday, Candlemas Day. And in Northern Europe, people were looking at hedgehogs to try to predict whether winter would continue. When they came to North America, Pennsylvania, they started looking at Puxatonic Phil. Marmots, however, are very important these days because if you know how big a marmot is, you know how far to stay away from people. So marmots keep you safe. You want to stay 3 marmots apart, you know, for your physical distancing. I've studied 8 of the 15 species of marmots around the world. Marmots have a whole Arctic distribution. They're found around the Northern Hemisphere. They look like marmots, right? Marmots are marmots are marmots. Marmots are related to ground squirrels and prairie dogs, of course. But in this genus Marmota, there's remarkable social variation from the rather unsocial groundhog, although as Chris and others are studying, they're probably more social than we attribute, to super social, multiple overlapping generations, cooperation in some of these Eurasian species. Yellow-bellied marmots do a bit of everything. The flaviventer that I study does a bit of everything, and the social plasticity is really good for that reason. I study them these days in the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory, where in 1962, as I said, Ken Armitage started what ended up being a very long-term study. We've just completed a partial 69th year of study. We were able to get out there late, but late is better than never. And we hope to have a full 50th year. We hope to have a full 60th year in the coming year. So yellow-bellied marmots are harem polygynous. Males associate with one or more breeding females. The most common, if you look at the long term, the most common association is monogamous, but if anything, males try to defend more than one female. They're socially variable. They're found in a wide range of group sizes. Predation is an important major source of summer mortality, and overwinter mortality is a major source of demographic variation as well. So they have to survive a hibernation period. And groups vary in their exposure to predators. They have an annual cycle, and a lot of Ken's work really focused on this annual cycle and understanding it. And because marmots live in a variety of habitats, in Colorado alone, yellow-bellied marmots have almost a 10,000-foot elevation range. And if you look at their whole range, they have almost a 15,000-foot elevation range, because around Vancouver, they're down living at sea level, and then they live to the tops of the highest 14,000-foot mountains in the Rockies and the Sierras. But they have an annual cycle. Where we study them, they emerge from hibernation in April or May. They continue to lose body mass if there's still snow. When we sort of define when 50% of the group's been seen, we sort of say the group's emerged. And when 50% of the snow has melted, things start greening up immediately, and we sort of say the growing season has started. They have about a 30-day gestation, about a 25-day lactation. And when they emerge when pups emerge from their burrow, they're essentially weaned. Every once in a while, you see some nursing above ground, but pretty much they're weaned. We've had some tragedies where mothers have been hit by cars the day the pups came out, and the pups were able to survive until they were hit by cars. So, they can be more or less independent. Yearlings disperse. Pretty much all the males leave home, and about half the females. So there's a lot of interesting dynamics in what explains dispersal in females. Pups emerge in late June or July. And everyone gains mass. Marmots at least double their body mass. Obesity is something that people study in marmots from a physiological perspective, because they get obese without having bad health consequences. We would like to do that. And getting fat for a marmot is a good thing. And they hibernate in late September, early October until April the next year. So they sort of fit the northern hemispheric academic calendar quite nicely. And I was department chair for 7 years, but before that, I would always go to my chair. Got to go to the field. The marmots are getting up earlier. The climate change is changing and shifting the seasonal cycle. Then I became chair. It's like, oh, what do I do now? I can't leave all the time. In any event, we spend a lot of time during their active season trapping them, live trapping them regularly. We do our best not to hurt these animals. I mean, we have extremely low trap mortality by design. We mark them, we observe them, and we do this throughout their active season. We take a variety of measurements. We quantify social interactions whenever we see them. These are not primates. They are not that social. If your eyes are on a colony, you can get many of these social interactions. So we do behavior sampling for that. And then we've been pioneers in sort of using social network statistics to try to ask questions with marmots. More traditional, ecological drivers of social variation that people, think about is it explained by food limitation or infanticide risk or predation risk? And from some of Ken's work, higher alpine populations may be food limited. Individuals don't breed every year at higher elevation sites. We work about a 5-kilometer section of the valley, ranging from about 9,400 feet to 10,000 feet. but studies have gone up higher in the region and over time, and you know, they don't breed every year there, and seems to be food limitation. Larger habitat patches have more adult females, so you know, if there's food around, you get more animals. They don't seem to be density dependent. Isn't something that jumps out at us. Having said that, we've sort of had a natural experiment. It has been getting warmer, and the snow is melting earlier on average, and marmots are getting up earlier than they did in the past. And so the whole phenology is changing. Now, you might expect that to be good for marmots because they have a longer growing season, they have more time to gain mass. It's warmer, and if you look at marmot emergence, its influence seemingly, you know, associated with temperature. There's some interesting social dynamics here because for every additional male in the group, adult male, they get up earlier, about 4 days earlier as well, because probably reproductive competition. Males get up first, they dig out their females, sometimes they bring flowers to them to reproduce. Anyway, at least in the first decade of the 2000s of this millennia, we had a huge population increase, much bigger than we've ever seen before. This was followed by a long winter and a huge crash. And remarkably, since 2010-11, we haven't really had recovery. You know, it bounces along, but it hasn't really gone up again. So we continue to study this. Groups vary annually in size and structure. If we look at non-pup females at one of our colony sites, Marmot Meadow, we can look at social networks, and we see not only different numbers of groups, but also different structures in groups, how animals are associating with each other. And we calculate these social network statistics and social networks in a variety of ways, but basically these are all based on observing animals, who's interacting with whom. And that variation is quite interesting. Adriana and I were looking at sort of, as groups get bigger, what happens to sociality. And if anything, we see marmots become less social as group size increases compared to what might be expected by random models of association. And one of the themes that I'm going to be talking about today is that, you know, I don't think this species wants to be social. I think it's sort of forced on them. And we're finding lots of costs of sociality. And as groups get bigger, marmots don't necessarily keep up with everyone, and they, if anything, they isolate themselves. And we've documented a variety of costs of sociality. Infanticide, of course, is something that is found in marmots and ground squirrels and prairie dogs. And in golden marmots I studied in Pakistan for my PhD, you know, almost a quarter of pup mortality was attributable to infanticide. And alpine marmots, which are pretty social as well, they're infanticidal, but it's a little less common than golden marmots. It's been reported, but very limited in yellow-bellied marmots. I mean, I've seen, you know, what I inferred to be infanticide in golden marmots. A new male comes into a group, and all the pups are, you know, disappear immediately. You see escape wounds on pups, and then everyone's dead, and you don't find them anymore. We don't have that happening in yellow-bellieds. It might happen periodically, but I don't think it's that common. Predation's kind of interesting. Predation influences population persistence. So because we've been studying marmots at these various sites for so long, we can actually have we're an opportunity to sort of ask the question, you know, how does food versus risk influence population persistence? And if we look at colony sites and we quantify things associated with risk or fear, and I'm going to say the fall line and the number of large rocks, those provide security. If you're in a steep slope, you have good visibility, and in areas where there are large rocks, you're protected from predators. Turns out that those explain significant variation in whether colony sites have gone extinct. In this case, I think we analyzed this with about 40 some years of data. Whereas food, grass cover or vegetation height doesn't seem to explain variation in persistence. Not only does this explain variation in whether colony sites go extinct or not, the same variables are important when you develop models of where are marmots. Marmots are where marmots have been, and marmots are more likely to be in places with good visibility, steep slopes, and large rocks. Predators are very important to marmots, and this is important because I'll be talking about social security later on. Predators are important. Marmots have a sophisticated ability to communicate about predation risk that includes the ability to identify individuals by their alarm calls and discriminate between reliable and unreliable individuals. Marmots allocate time to anti-predator vigilance, which we know to be a heritable trait. Marmots modify vigilance based on visibility, which Peter Bednikoff and I experimentally studied by manipulating visibility. They can recognize the sight, sound, and smells of their predators, even extinct predators, wolves, which have been extinct for at least 100 years around where we are, and they respond appropriate to these things. They dig burrows into which they escape. We've done a lot of studies of flight initiation distance, and they hide in these burrows optimal time. So they're very sensitive to the cost of hiding versus the benefits that might be outside. They adaptively vary their flight behavior. And as I like to teach my students here, if you're surfing alone, you've got some risk of predation. If you're surfing with others, you dilute your risk of predation. And we know that sociality dilutes predation risk. But that's a very sort of unidimensional view of thinking about risk. Group size clearly is one of these things that is important in anti-predator behavior. But groups are more than, individuals are more than simply numbers. Group size is but one of many social attributes. Individuals may have preferential relationships with others. They may be more or less connected to others in the group. They may be more or less socially isolatable. So one of the things I've been doing and thinking a lot about is how we think about putting numbers to these things, how we ask questions, think about what I'll call a variety of social attributes. So consider the central individual. These are groups with 7 individuals in all of the groups, but the structure of how they're structured is different. In the leftmost group, the central individual is sort of isolated between 2 groups, and the center group, center panel, the central individual is isolated where everyone else is connected. I'm sure all of us feel like that at some point. And if we're lucky, maybe we feel centrally connected to everyone else, unless you're worried about getting COVID, in which case you probably want to be more isolated than not. So I think if nothing else, social network statistics make a lot more sense when you're thinking about pandemic threats and your own risks during a pandemic than maybe ever before. So Robert Hind, thought about what is sociality and sort of introduced this idea of an emergent view a number of years ago. You can have independent animals that can aggregate and then form social groups and have relationships that have structure. And Peter so beautifully summarized how we can think about these different attributes of sociality and different ways to study social behavior in his review from 2019 that many people have been talking about already, and he talked about last week, so I won't go into it more, other than to say that I'm really focusing on social network statistics here and thinking about these as defining social attributes. So I think that, as I've been saying, social network statistics formally define what I'll call attributes of sociality. I'm really pushing this, so nothing else. Hopefully we can talk about this later, but I'd like to know what you think about this idea of attributes of sociality. Social network statistics define direct relationships, but they also kind of conflate direct and indirect relationships. You can't isolate the indirect relationships, but once you're thinking about a network, you're thinking about your position and who you interact with. Lauren introduced me, but Lauren is associated with Karsten, so therefore I'm associated with Karsten. That's an indirect interaction, an indirect relationship. And I think by studying social network statistics and their consequences, we can begin to ask the value, question the value, and quantify the value of these indirect relationships. For sexually transmitted diseases, we know those indirect relationships are very important. But are they important in other things that behavioral ecologists might be interested in quantifying? You can quantify them all sorts of different ways. With marmots, because marmots have an address, they have burrows, they live in physical location. We know who lives there. So we don't have to play the gambit of the group. We can say, here's the physical location. Who's interacting affiliatively with each other? Who's interacting agonistically? We can ask these questions directionally. We can weight or look at binary relationships. And we've done a bit of all of these things. And it really, I'll just admit it now. I study social behavior and I don't know what social behavior is. Even with Peter's taxonomy, I just don't. I mean, it really depends on the question you're asking, how you want to go out and quantify social behavior or social relationships. And a lot of our effort goes into thinking about that beforehand. And a lot of the problem, I would say, with social network statistics is coming up with clean interpretations of things. And we struggle with this constantly. We can look at these relationships directly, or we can use some sort of dimension reduction techniques to reduce them. Many of them are correlated, and we've done all of these. We can use randomization techniques or not use randomization techniques, and Adriana and I will argue about this, but I mean, I think that you can, that you make all sorts of assumptions when you come up with random models, and you have to be really clear about those assumptions if you're going to use them. I'm going to say that what I'm doing here, and by the way, exploratory research gets a really bad name. I'm not fishing. I would say this is structured exploration, and I think that's okay. And I'm going to defend that scientifically. And if you don't want to believe it, don't believe anything I'm doing. Just ask the same questions in your systems, and let's see what we can learn from this. But we're structuring a process where we're looking for questions with, in many cases, directional hypotheses, but we don't know the right way to measure these things. We don't really know, what is the key social attribute to measure. So call it fishing if you want to be negative, call it structured exploratory research, which I think is fine. I think very few people do confirmatory research. I don't think we should fool ourselves into believing we do confirmatory research. Some people do. You're testing, a blood pressure drug on a population that's been tested, a new population, or doing the nth test of something or the 100th test of something. I'd say that's confirmatory research. But at the end of the day, most behavioral ecologists aren't doing confirmatory research. Don't fool yourself into believing it. We can talk about that later too. So what are some potentially important social attributes? Well, degree, the number of direct relationships with others. That's a direct measure. Strength, the frequency of interactions with others. That's a direct measure. Closeness centrality. There are many ways of looking at centrality measures. The number of links it takes to reach others in the network. If you're playing Whisper Down the Line, that's going to be important. This quantifies both direct and indirect measures of sociality, social attributes. Eigenvector centrality, how close an individual is to other central individuals. How close are you to power? Or maybe how close are you to the person who's the super spreader? Embeddedness, the connectedness of an individual to its subgroup. Again, quantifies both direct and indirect measures as well. I'm a proselytizer of Nico Tinbergen. I believe that we learn a lot by doing Tinbergian analyses. And I think that what we want to be doing with our studies of anything, but particularly social network statistics, is think a bit about their development. Are they heritable? I mean, I don't even know what a heritable social relationship is. I mean, we can quantify it, but clearly it's getting at some propensity. But nonetheless, is there heritable variation in them? Are they consequential? I'm not doing experimental tests necessarily of this, but in a correlative sense, can we detect associations between particular network traits and fitness correlates that might be important? And importantly, and you can't underestimate this, do they help us answer interesting biological questions? I mean, there's a whole network theory out there, which is super interesting, but it's just sort of, the math of relationships, and that's fine. That is not why I'm using these attributes. I'm using these attributes as something that are more complex than simple group size to understand something about the value of relationships, to animals. So Tina Wei and I, a number of years ago, determined that age and kinship influence affiliation preference. Marmots are more friendly to others in the same age class. and to closer relatives, meaning they engage in more affiliative interactions. There's less consistent rules for who fights. So if you're in a group that's more or less kin structured, you're probably going to be fighting with your kin anyway. But you know, the homophily rules of interacting with similar aged animals, turns out similar sex animals to some extent as well, and relatives is really kind of what structures these groups. Age and sex influence social tendencies. Older animals and male marmots are crankier. Older marmots receive fewer affiliative interactions and they initiate more and receive less aggression. Females receive affiliation from more partners and males initiate aggression to more individuals. So we can look at the development of social interactions. Females are the sort of the heart of these marmot societies. They live in matrilineal societies and they get crankier as they get older. We have an observational genealogy that goes back to 1962, and since 2002, we have a genetic genealogy. This was a database pull I did a while ago. I need to update this one. But with this genealogy, we can use the animal model and begin partitioning out sources of variation. We can control for common environment. We can control for group effects. We can control for year. I think these variance decomposition techniques in general are extremely exciting. And I think if you got the data, I think they really tell us something more than simply looking at a particular trait. So by building in the heritable variation and trying to estimate that, even if it's estimated with some error, I think is kind of exciting. So here we're looking at additive genetics variation, social group variation, permanent environment variation. And the question we were asking is, can network position be heritable? So we went into this with a whole series of a priori expectations that things you're doing to others, if anything's going to be heritable, it's what I do to you, and it's probably going to be the direct stuff because that's going to be important, and that's going to be under an individual's control. And what we found was the network position could be heritable, but it was the agonistic stuff, nasty things, not nice things, that had sort of more significant heritability. And it wasn't the out degree, it was the in degree, if anything. And the attractiveness had significant additive genetic variation in these social network statistics. And really, one way we scratched our head with this a whole while, and we sort of interpreted this as basically there's heritable victimization. What others do to you and your ability to tolerate aggression directed at you is what's heritable. And I think that's actually kind of interesting because if anything, it kind of suggests, if you live in a social group, it's only one dominant individual, right? Everyone else is going to get some aggression. And these guys aren't beating themselves up. Aggression is actually very rare, rarely seen. But, maybe there's going to be tolerance in the ability to take it. And maybe that tolerance in the ability to take it is heritable, which I think is what we have. And maybe that's going to influence who sticks around and who disperses. So this heritable victimization was completely surprising and contrary to all of our a priori hypotheses, but I think makes some sense in retrospect. So does sex matter? Marmots differ in the nature of their social relationships. Social relationships should be relatively more important to females because these are matrilineal groups where the groups get bigger when mothers allow their daughters to stick around, and then you get multiple generations of females living together. We were able to begin to look at this by thinking about Mark Bekoff's social cohesion hypothesis, which is a reasonable but poorly tested hypothesis to explain variation and dispersal. The idea was that more cohesive individuals would be less likely to disperse. And here we thought a lot about, what influences or what could influence dispersal. And one of the members of Tina Wei's dissertation committee was a sociologist who does a lot of network stuff. And he's like, you should think about embeddedness. Embeddedness might be a measure that is going to be useful for thinking about sort of relationships and severing relationships, and might be associated, you know, in a predictive way with dispersal. The idea of embeddedness is how cohesive is your subgroup. So all of these individuals here have the same number, interact with, you know, four individuals. They all have the same degree, but they vary in how embedded they are in their subgroup. Individual one here is very easily isolatable by snipping, you know, some of these lines, where any individual here stays connected to their subgroup if one thing is snipped. So we looked at embeddedness. And what we found is that females with a tighter group of friends were more likely to stick around at home and not disperse. Remember, about 50% of females disperse as yearlings, that don't disperse as yearlings, and it seems that embeddedness explains some of this variation. We didn't expect this would explain variation in male dispersal because most males disperse. And in fact, we found, most males disperse, but we found that embeddedness did not influence dispersal in males. So social variation may have some fitness consequences. Turns out being a bully, being more aggressive, enhanced male reproductive success, or is associated with enhanced male reproductive success. Dominant males have more reproductive success. We know that. Dominance is a network measure after all. It's just one attribute of social relationships. Social factors didn't strongly influence ectoparasite or endoparasite infection. Males are kind of gross, have more parasites than females. There's a tendency for animals with higher affiliation strength to have fewer fleas. There might be a slight benefit of affiliative relationships, but these things didn't jump out at us. We looked at internal parasites. We didn't find good associations there. Marmots are generalist herbivores. They live, in colony sites. Everyone's pooping everywhere. You pretty much have parasites. There is some variation, but as we were quantifying it, it really wasn't explained by social relationships. We're doing interesting stuff now with gut bacteria, and there'll be some fun stuff coming out sooner rather than later, I hope, looking at that. Friendlier females, those with stronger affiliation strength, if anything, had reduced reproductive success. So if anything, there isn't a benefit from associating with others, but there's a cost to affiliative relationships. So, we all end up studying animals that share our propensities. So, yellow-bellied marmots don't want to be social. I'm not sure I want to be social either. But, I here we can sort of, engage in the naturalistic fallacy and, sort of look at marmots, and it's like, hey, they don't want to be social. They're not benefiting from being social. Females that have tighter relationships with others, if anything, have reduced reproductive success. You can ask if this is a consequence of greater group size, and it's not. You can control for group size, and it, it's still really about if the relationships that they have. Marmots that are nicer to each other are more likely to die over winter. A critical reviewer noted that this is seemingly driven by 3 observations down here, and I'm not going to deny those observations. They're good observations. Why? Just because something's an outlier doesn't mean you get rid of it if it's a good one. I mean, these are hard data to collect. You don't believe this? Let's look at other results. Again, I'm not trying to sell any particular result. I'm trying to sell a way to look at things and examine and understand sociality, in this case in marmots. So we know from people that strong social relationships are associated with longer, healthier lives. Smoking about a pack of cigarettes a day reduces your longevity in humans about as much as being socially isolated does in humans. But studies in non-human primates, in baboons and other species have shown that species that are more socially connected, that have more amicable social relationships, live longer as well. And in a variety of other highly social species, insects, bighorn sheep, orca, meerkats, and some colonial birds, more social animals live longer. Now, yellow-bellied marmots seemingly don't want to really be social, and they're not obligately social. So let's look at what's going on with longevity in marmots. And we had a whole bunch of traits we were looking at, and we found that if anything, more social marmots live shorter lives. Those that were closer to others, those that more in degree, more in closeness, those that we reflected this so that more means, so that on the x-axis to the right means more tightly connected, negative average task length, out degree. All of these decreased longevity significantly. And for the traits we measured that didn't significantly increase longevity, many of the slopes were negative, which is kind of interesting. And it was kind of interesting, and I sort of suggested that, maybe this is associated with this facultative sociality, and Eric Lucas and Lauren Keller did a really nice comparative study where they sort of, found that the benefits of social life in terms of increased survival are common only in species in which life in large groups is already the norm, most likely because these species have adapted to depend on social groups. By contrast, species with smaller social groups tend to show no clear association between survival and social group size. So it seems that social species are the highly obligately social species are the ones that are likely to benefit maybe from maintaining social relationships, but we need to study more facultatively social and less social species to look at that. But the question comes up, these guys are social, but why should they be social? What's going on? Can we find any benefits of sociality? So I sort of said, well, look, we don't have Social Security in the US. Maybe marmots have some form of Social Security. And if you're looking for Social Security, you should begin looking at it in terms of alarm calling dynamics, because animals may be helping themselves by alarm calling. So we asked the question, does an individual's social relationships influence its probability of emitting an alarm call? The idea is if you're emitting an alarm call, it could be because you're scared, or it could be to warn others in a tight group. And we sort of use, in this case, principal component analysis to reduce dimensionality. And we've sort of defined popularity as our PC1 and relationship strength as our PC2. And what we found was, if you look at who calls, and we spend a lot of time sitting and trying to identify alarm calling marmots in the wild. And most of the time we hear the modal number of alarm calls given is 1, and then you have a bunch of pucker-faced marmots looking at you, and you don't know who called. So there's a lot of uncertainty with that. Fortunately, we also know that when we go up to a trap, marmots may call. And it turns out that marmots that are likely to call in the trap are actually more likely to call naturally as well. So this trap calling assay is a pretty good assay, maybe, of what's going on. So in the wild, we found that less popular marmots called at a higher rate. Marmots that were not tightly embedded in their social network, marmots without a lot of direct social interactions, were more likely to call in the wild. A small effect, mind you. We also found that marmots in weaker relationships were more likely to call in the trap, and a stronger relationship because we have better quality data on calling here. What might explain this pattern? I would suggest that these animals are more afraid. That animals that are that don't have that social support in some sense are more likely to call. Now remember, alarm calls can be directed to conspecifics to warn them, or to create pandemonium, as clearly happens in some squirrels, or it could be directed to the predator, probably to tell it to piss off. So when predators require stealth, identifying that the predator has been detected, kind of implies that the game's up. Regardless, marmots, maybe more isolated, afraid marmots, are more likely to call. Does an individual's social relationships influence its response to alarm calls? Well, if marmots with strong affiliative relationships felt more secure, they would forage more and allocate less time to vigilance in response to hearing alarm calls. So we've done a lot of playbacks over the years where we bait animals to a location about 1 meter away from the burrow, and we have a hidden speaker, a couple more meters away, and then we play a standardized, set of alarm calls. And in this case, we use all novel alarm calls. We use calls from animals they never heard or never could have heard to ask how they respond to alarm calls. And we've published a lot on alarm response to alarm calls. And so here we focused on in strength and in closeness, which were variables that explain most of the variation in these two orthogonal factors. Reviewers encouraged us to use randomization statistics, which we can talk about later, but nonetheless, higher in closeness was associated with increased vigilance, and higher in strength was associated with increased foraging. So animals that were, more connected, stronger relationships, foraged more after they heard these calls, but they also looked around more, which was interesting. And why might this be? Well, all calls were from novel individuals in this case, and we know that there are many species that have been studied have pretty good neighbor-stranger responses, meaning they can detect animals that live spatially near them versus more distant animals. So maybe these novel calls led to increased vigilance, much as neighbor-stranger playbacks lead to increased vigilance because they know this is not a neighbor. Who's the stranger? Marmots are attuned to others that live around them. They value social relationships, whether these are good or bad. They know what's going on around them. So marmots maybe are keeping track of others, and this knowledge provides some sense of security. Can an individual's social relationships influence its behavior while foraging? If relationships influence security, then animals that are more central to their network might feel safer and look less while naturally foraging. We conduct focal animal samples on foraging animals regularly, and we use this database to interrogate what explains variation in foraging in a comprehensive way. And we found that females with greater betweenness and those that lived in larger social groups looked less when using binary analyses, but not when using weighted analysis. But we found no effect of social relationships in males. Males foraging in larger groups looked less, but the social relationships didn't matter. Again, suggesting that sex influences the value of relationships. Group size is interesting because you benefit from a group size simply by dilution, no matter what. But the relationships seem to matter for females, but not for males. So I'd like to conclude from this series of analyses that social relationships may influence perceptions of security, which may differ by sex. The specific attributes differ across analyses. I think that attributes in general matter, and that this sort of is promising, saying that maybe this attribute-driven way of thinking about the value of sociality is useful. Social support may be important. We know that social support reduces stress responses in humans and a variety of non-human primates and rodents as well. Let's begin thinking about social support as a possible benefit of social relationships in marmots, and ask that question. So we know that stressors can be detected physiologically. Marmots who struggle in a trap had higher fecal glucocorticoid metabolite levels 24 hours later. We trap them regularly. We get poop from them. We extract fecal glucocorticoid metabolite levels as some measure of stress. And most animals don't struggle in the trap. Those that do we can detect it 24 hours later. Jen Smith did a formal ACTH challenge in the marmots, and so we have a validated metric when we look at our fecal glucocorticoid metabolites. So we know there seem to be consequences of being stressed in higher predator pressure colonies where in a given year we're seeing relatively more predators. We see that and where there is mortality and where pups are more likely to be killed during the summer, we see that mothers have higher fecal glucocorticoid metabolite levels, higher physiological measures of stress. We know that pups from more stressed mothers have reduced survival, but interestingly, this is only in larger litters, not smaller litters. I think one of the other sort of meta messages from this study is in behavioral ecology, we're often dealing with rather small effect sizes, and we often don't get big main effects, but we should figure out how to interrogate our data and plan our experiments to look for interactions, because I think interactions in general are important. And here we see an interaction that is explained by litter size, not by, there's not a main effect of stress and survival, but it depends on litter size. As female cohesiveness increased, stress levels reduced, but again, not overall, remarkably only in low predator pressure environments. Females living in more cohesive groups and high predator pressure environments, there's really no variation. But in low predator pressure environments, cohesiveness, more cohesive females have lower maternal glucocorticoid hormones. So here we're finding a conditional potential benefit of living in more cohesive groups. So we look at a whole series of attributes. More social yearling females have enhanced summer survival, but we didn't find it in yearling males. We didn't really find it in adult males. We didn't find it in adult females. So really it's the summer survivals influencing a particular cohort of individuals. We shouldn't expect that relationships are similarly valuable throughout an individual's life. We need to look at this ontogenetically. So what are some take-home messages from this? And this is a mountain lion in our backyard that in Colorado that we locked up the kid after seeing that. Actually, I didn't see it, our neighbor did. But predatory stressors have consequences. Social buffering may reduce some of these consequences, but these sociality's benefit may be cohort specific, and it may act through interactions with, among other things, predation risk. In our case, yearling females may benefit a bit during the summer. Now, I've been talking a lot about marmots. We've all been talking about our species that we are inordinately attached to, but this really isn't a story about marmots. I'm really trying to push this idea that I think social attributes may be a generally useful way to think about relationships and the value of sociality. And by digging down and looking at these attributes, I think we can develop a different way of thinking about the costs and benefits of sociality. What does an attribute-based approach towards understanding sociality look like? Well, I think that, as I've been saying, the value of social network analyses isn't a precise definition of social attributes. I think I've shown that attributes can have different consequences, at least in a correlative way. And really, thinking about this stemmed from my work years ago, thinking about communicative complexity, and work with Kim Pollard, who was a PhD student in my lab years ago. Kim and I were looking at a comparative study and conducting a comparative study, looking at how social complexity might be associated with communicative complexity. And Kim wasn't analyzing data, and I'm like, I keep asking her, what's up? And she comes in one day and says, well, I finally got the answers and you're not gonna like it. I'm like, what do you mean I'm not gonna like it? Got answers, that's good. And she's like, well, your social complexity metric doesn't explain anything. I go, great, what else do you find? She's like, group size does. I'm like, well, isn't that interesting? So we were looking at vocal individuality, and it turns out that group size is associated with the evolution of vocal individuality. My previous work looking at repertoire size in Sayurid rodents found a strong association with demographic role variability, social complexity measured in a different way. We shouldn't expect one thing to explain all outcome variables. We should expect different traits to have different consequences and to explain different things. We know from other studies and other people's work, mating systems seem to drive the evolution of complex repertoires and syntax. Not just one measure of sociality, that there could be different sorts of relationships out there for different sorts of outcome variables. So what does a trait-based or an attribute-based study of sociality look like? I think it looks like we want to come up with drivers, we want to think about our attributes, we want to think about our consequences. So in my system, and maybe others, we're thinking about temperature and snow melt and age and sex and predators and parasites. Those might be potential drivers that might be associated with group size, group demographic mechanisms, and a suite of social network parameters. And then there might be consequences. Those, depending on how you draw your path diagrams, physiological stress, or litter size, or survival, or dispersal, or age of first reproduction, or longevity, all of these could be consequences. And then, we want to begin filling out this lookup table. What's associated with what? So I think the challenge is to fill up tables like this. Connor Filson is in a second year working with me, and last year when he was, and we're thinking about not individual levels of ways of thinking about social attributes, but rather group level attributes. And social network statistics have a whole suite of ways to define group level attributes. And I said, Connor, why don't you come up with some sort of a diagram to summarize, because he's reading all the old papers, to summarize sort of what we have. And, we need to go and fill this out more. But, we've sort of looked at many of these things so far in yellow-bellied marmots. And what's interesting is that many of these relationships are blue, which are negative relationships, particularly between attributes and consequences. But a number of these positive relationships are actually quantifying, or between things that quantify indirect measures as well. And I think the fact that some of these positive things come from these not just direct measures but indirect measures as well tells us that there's value in looking at social network statistics that quantify not simply direct measures of affiliation or dominance or aggression, but that capture these indirect measures as well. So, in the future, I think, more synthetic studies like this will be coming out of my lab, trying to develop this, understanding of marmot social complexity. So that was a lot. Let's take a stretch. What are some take-home messages from this? Ecological factors influence demography and population size, of course. Social interactions emerge from the opportunity to be social, but not necessarily in the way we expect, at least in yellow-bellied marmots. If anything, yellow-bellied marmots are less social given an opportunity to be more social. Social network statistics allowed us to define attributes of sociality and to study these attributes of sociality. Social attributes may have consequences. These consequences may be sex-specific and age-specific. Predatory stress has negative fitness consequences and may be reduced by social buffering to some extent, but again, not a uniform statement. It may be for certain cohorts of individuals. These benefits of sociality may be cohort specific. We need to really be looking, I think, for thinking about wise interactions to put in our models. We're trying to understand social variation. And I think that moving forward, my goal, and I hope I've convinced some people that our goal should be to identify precisely how sociality affects fitness. And I think a social attribute approach is going to be useful in that. And with that, I'm going to say that was about 50 minutes, and why don't we stop and open it up for discussion.
Thanks, Dan. Excuse me. That was really cool. It was an amazing talk. So now we have an opportunity for discussion. As it works is just a reminder, if you got a question, please drop a question mark in the chat function. If you're coming from YouTube, we got someone tracking you and they'll ask questions. And so now I'll just turn it over to the people who have questions for Dan. And I'll start with Eduardo, please.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Lauren. Oh my goodness, I was taking notes of all the things that I want to bring up and discuss with you. So I have to make a choice. And I think that the choice I've made is probably closer to something that we discussed quite a bit at the beginning of the seminar series. We haven't really gone back, which for me is extremely important. I really enjoy your talk. Maybe there were some things that you said that I did take very, very seriously, and I hope our younger colleagues as well. You're speaking so broadly, so refreshingly about how we should be looking at data and looking and considering what we're learning from those data. So let me look at my notes so that I can be organized in what I want to bring up. But actually, I was chatting with with two of the students working with me, asking them about this idea. You said to us, maybe you'll think I'm fishing, and there's a negative connotation to that. So that really got me going. And I'll start with the end, and then I'll give a little bit of context. I would like you to comment some more on the subtle comments you made about randomization, and to discuss some more your approach to data examination, because you made a comment about having had some fun conversations and discussions about the use of randomization to make sense of the data we collect. And you said that maybe we'll consider it negative that you go on fishing. And I share with you those concerns, and I've struggled with them, and we've read about them. That's why I was asking Alex and David about it. I'm totally with you. The problem I see is that we're going too fast into trying to make inferences from data without having really explored the data. And we did nail down with David and Alexa, there's a wonderful paper by Dochterman, 2011, in Methods in Ecology and Evolution, where really they lay out what you're just saying. There's nothing wrong with looking at data to develop a priori hypotheses to help us understand patterns, provided then you don't use those same data to confirm that you have figured out the specifics of the question you're exploring.
Well, I'm gonna, so two things. Let's just talk about fishing, and then we can talk about randomization. I'm gonna say that that's really difficult to understand what a social network statistic really quantifies. And, we spend a lot of our time scratching our heads. And, if we're dealing with an analysis that sort of says something about centrality, well, there's many different measures of centrality. And we're trying to think, before we look at our data, we're trying to think, what might be the relationship between centrality and something we're interested in looking at. And then we're going to say, well, here's a whole bunch of measures of centrality. I mean, I think the longevity paper is a perfect example of that. Here's a bunch of measures of connectedness and centrality that have been shown or hypothesized or asserted to be important in explaining longevity in humans and maybe some other species as well. So we don't have an axe in any single measure, and we actually don't know which measure is the best measure to do. But we're not sort of looking at our data and trying to come up and fish around and say, oh, no, it must be centrality. We're actually thinking beforehand and trying to sort of structure it that way. There's nothing wrong with going and just absolutely fishing, but I think that that putting the effort beforehand. So there's something called as predicted. So there's all this sort of open science and publisher protocols and whatever, and we're playing around with as predicted now. And for a path analysis, which I think is one of the better things to come out of my lab in a while, it still is not accepted. Looking at vigilance, we went through as predicted. As predicted is the easiest way to publish your protocol because it's based at UPenn. It's put together by a bunch of, I think, economists and sociologists, I think. And it's just, answer a few questions and don't give us too many details. But then you can go back and say, here's what I was intending to do going into it. And what you're supposed to do with these sorts of things is, and this was going to be an experiment for us. Let's see how that works in behavioral ecology, because people are saying you're supposed to publish your protocols. So we go and we do as predicted. We thought really hard about this. And then we start analyzing our data. And this is a really gnarly modern path analysis, DCEP analysis that led to some things where we realized we had hierarchical levels that were really complex and we weren't analyzing it correctly. So we had to change how we did our analysis. So in our as predicted, when we wrote about it, we said, here's our as predicted, and here's what we did differently in our analyses than what we said we were going to do going in, right? So we send it to some big journal and they say not interesting. Who cares about vigilance? Okay, well, we think it's one of the better analyses of vigilance out there. It's a path analysis. And then, path analysis is fraught because some people don't believe it's a causal analysis, but other people do believe it's a causal analysis. And this goes back to Fisher winning the war. And then, we send it to some other place and, it gets rejected there. Then we send it to Proc B and they say, oh, well, you didn't support, we have negative results. You didn't support your a priori hypothesis, so therefore it must be wrong. And oh my God. I mean, if we're Proc B, they should know better, right? If we're trying to increase open science, you want to sort of put your thought beforehand. You want to try to, this is my experiment with this. You want to try to put your, what your analyses are going to be and what your, and then you want to sort of, and then it shouldn't matter what your answers are. And we really did all this work before we did any analyses. And then we get a negative result, which I think is kind of cool. And, can't get the thing in Proc B. So let's review elsewhere right now. But, I think that you want to put effort into thinking through your analyses before whenever possible. But there are things in this case where we don't have one well understood measure. And I think we're still in sort of the Wild West era of going and saying, well, what measures might be? I mean, we know a lot about group size, but group size is one attribute. Does that address your question?
Yes, no, this is fantastic. A couple of quick comments and I'll let other ones ask. I'm going to post in the chatting. There's some papers by Locasio in a recent volume of the American Statistician calling for results blind publications. Imagine a world where the quality of your research would be judged by your a priori thinking, your methods, your study design, et cetera, regardless of what the data say. So I'll share that. And then
we've read a lot of those papers in American Statistician, and I came away not really buying it.
Okay, we can talk about that. The other one, which is huge for this group, you're talking about the need that you have all these measures. I really agree with you. I just want to share with those colleagues of ours who are not immersed in the primate literature that so much of what we read about the strength of social bonds in primates comes down to grooming and proximity in baboons. And so if we're going to have this dialogue across taxa, from bacteria to primates to marmots to insects, we will need to be more explicit about what we mean by a bond, by sociality, which is exactly what you're doing with having a whole list of variables. The composite sociality index, which again, non-primate people keep referring to, measures just the distance between two individuals and how much they groom. That for some of a huge range of primate taxa we feel it doesn't really tell us much about the quality of relationships. So
it tells you about one dimension of relationship. Right. I mean, we get different social network parameters for affiliative versus agonistic. A paper which I have in review right now shows that they are absolutely orthogonal. They are not associated. So how and what you focus on quantifying, has to sort of be thought out in the context of the questions you're asking. There is no one measure of sociality.
Thank you.
Okay, so the next question comes in from Maren Huck, and just I forgot to remind everyone, please, since we're still all getting to know each other, please state your name and where you're coming from.
I'm Maren. I'm from the University of Derby, and I really very much enjoyed your talk. I'm a little bit sorry to sort of go down from this more broader discussion that you had between Eduardo and you just now. My question is, I don't know whether it's a simple one, but you stated relatively early on that the friendlier females had reduced reproductive success, and also other marmots were more likely to die if they were friendlier. And then you suggested that this might indicate that there could be a cost associated to it. I was wondering whether you can clearly say that it is not that they are friendlier in order to overcome any disadvantages that they would otherwise have. So if they are low ranking or something like that, they might be having higher costs anyway, and they might be friendly to reduce these higher costs that they would have anyway, and so have not quite as high cost. So can you distinguish?
Excellent question. I would say that I don't put a lot of faith in any single result I have. I don't believe in any single answer. I think that having a long view, and we've talked about this before, we can look at 20 years, 30 years of data and get one answer. We can look at another 20 or 30 years to get another answer. And that's not because we're cooking the books. That's because things vary. I think the way I would answer that is ontogenetically, we see females isolating themselves more as they get older. We see a cost to being too connected. So I think that actually the more control they have over their lives, the better they do. However, and importantly, dispersal is risky. Leaving home, going out, setting off, going somewhere else has mortality risk associated with it. Sticking around, making the best of a bad job is, if you can, maybe preferable to accepting those risks. And I think that younger animals are probably trying to maintain relationships to not be thrown out. I think that it comes back and bites them. It's so sad. The anecdotes sort of ring true, right? And you sort of, my God, this is what I'm seeing. There was this one male, and he was a sweetheart. Males vary in how they interact with their wives and their kids, and this guy was just so sweet. And all his kids and yearlings are hanging out with them, and I'm like, they're all going to be dead the next winter. And they didn't survive that winter. And I wonder, and this is after controlling the group size and things like that. We find that if you are nicer to others, you're less likely to survive the winter. I wonder if that's because they're interfering with each other's hibernation. I'm wondering if that's because they're getting up. Marmots, so hibernation is fascinating. We know from studies that we've done in captivity that they actively can suppress their body temperature faster than is just possible by simple diffusion. So the goal if you're hibernating is to get as cold as you can into your thermal neutral zone where you're burning. These guys burn, in their thermal neutral zone, burn 1 gram of fat a day. Big ones go into hibernation about 5 kilos. They're burning 1 gram of fat a day. That's extraordinary if you think about it. The cost of hibernation is periodic arousal. So as an aging man, I'm changing my mind on this, but there's an unanswered question in hibernation physiology. Do animals emerge, or come out of torpor to urinate, or do they urinate because they come out of torpor? So your kidneys aren't working and you're not able to filter stuff and get rid of waste unless you have blood pressure. In order to do that, you got to wake up and get it out. Although the process of waking up is very energetically expensive where you're making waste. So you can think about that however you want. But if they're waking up more over winter, they're probably facing this physiological cost, and they're probably using up all their energy. They might be more likely to use up their energy. Alpine marmots seem to get it together, and the benefit of sociality in alpine marmots from Walter Arnold's work is that they can coordinate their thermoregulatory bouts. But these guys, in some sense, are individualists, and maybe they're unable to coordinate, and maybe therefore they interfere if they have stronger relationships. To test that, we'd have to put temperature data loggers in them and see what's going on in the winter. So I think these multiple lines of evidence suggest that actually individuals may be paying a cost to be too social. But if you're a female in a low predation risk environment, you might get some social buffering benefits, et cetera. So we're beginning to find some of these benefits, but they're not knocking us on the eyes. But these guys have an address. They don't, and being at that address may have benefits. There are good places to be and there are bad places to be. And I think a lot of them are making the best of a bad job. I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay. So the next talk, which is a direct message to me, is from our next question. I'm sorry, is Michael Taborski, please.
Yes, Dan, thanks very much. It was most interesting. I must admit that I'm a bit more skeptical than you on the merits of social network statistics. But what I find really interesting from the approaches that you mentioned is the question and your analysis on whether network position is heritable. And I'm not sure whether I missed something, but I did not see that you were accounting for parental effects there. I may be wrong, as I
I think
said.
we had maternal, we had paternal, we had, I mean, you know, we got common environment. I mean, the problem with animals that share an environment and their parents is that, you know, it could be some of that stuff. And these, of course, are the animals that survive to an age where we could start measuring their relationships, et cetera. But it's not a perfect analysis, but it's the best we could do. And you know, the additive genetic variation is what we were able to detect. And again, it was more of it in nasty things others do to you rather than, in theory, what you have control over, which is doing things to others.
Okay.
And, you know, I'm really excited about these variance decomposition approaches. And there is a little bit of uncertainty, I will admit, because they're social animals that, you know, share so many of these other things. And we control for those as best we can.
Yeah, okay. I think that's a very good answer. I think that especially if it comes to the social position of an animal in a group, parental effects are of major importance, but apparently
in primates, maybe, I'm not sure in yellow-bellied marmots, in maybe more social animals. So looking at these maternal effects and maternal rank inheritance and things like that, I don't think these guys, you know, inherit rank. I mean, basically, body size is, you know, the biggest predictor of rank. So the biggest females, the biggest males. I'm collaborating with some people now on some additional analyses of rank right now, and we'll see what we get out of that. It'll be exciting, but they're not vervet monkeys.
Yeah, of course, but I think there is evidence from other animals that parental effects have a strong influence on the social position in a social group. Like, for example, gray-legged geese, where it has been shown that the offspring sort of inherit the rank of their parents to some extent, at least at the feeding grounds. But anyway, I mean, it's I think it has been covered. So thank you very much.
So is inheriting rank evidence of heritable network? I mean, it sort of is, actually.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's not based on additive genetic variance, but it is it's a component of heritability of a social position.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think for the relationship stuff, it's got to be through propensities to tolerate, or propensities to be outgoing, or propensities to seek out certain interactants. Again, the thing that puzzled us was it was the propensity to receive stuff, not to do stuff. That was, I mean, you know, that was what we could detect the heritability in. But I mean, it's not like, you know, foot length. It's not a morphological trait where the trait, in some sense, while it may have maternal and paternal effects as well, it's not easy. You know, it's not the same thing, which makes it a little more complex to think about. Yeah, social tendencies have been artificially selected for, you know, in other studies. So, you know, here we're just sort of quantifying those social tendencies more concretely.
Okay, thanks very much.
Yep.
All right, so our next question comes from Jordan Martin, please.
Hey, Dan. Thank you very much for your talk. I'm a PhD student at the University of Zurich, and just as a comment, I'm really enjoying the nature of fear. I'm going through it now, so not really related to the specifics of your talk today, but
very good, very nice.
So I have a really concrete, specific question, and then a broad question building on that. And I hope it's not too redundant with Michael's question. But so I wasn't exactly sure from your description of the life history of the marmots whether they're essentially in relatively stable groups, and you're quantifying the statistics kind of as a semi cross-sectional measure, or whether
no, they change every year. So
okay.
great question. They change every year, which is actually an attribute that allows us to have lots of variation and, get it. And it changes every year because, most of the yearlings disperse.
Okay.
But then it's sort of, then there's a key question. They live up to 16 years. Average longevity is 4.5 years. So there's, other demographic turnover as well. But the broader question is, for I think all of these analyses, we're looking at yearlings and older and adults. They can start breeding as 2-year-olds. Not all 2-year-olds breed, but they start breeding as 2-year-olds. For other questions, we might just be looking at subsets of them. So
Okay.
that degree of flexibility varies depending upon what you're looking at and what questions you're asking.
Okay, so so I wanted to ask, like, I guess independent of the source of the variance, how repeatable overall phenotypically these network measures were at an individual level. Like, are the individuals who tend to be having high, in connectedness or all the various measures, are they tending to have similarly high or low values between groups? And then the kind of follow-up question I had there, kind of coming back to what Michael said about what do the network measures tell us about individual attributes? I wondered whether you had plans, I guess, in terms of, like you said, potentially hypothesizing about thresholds or kind of more direct individual motivational or behavioral traits that you had whether you had plans to look at connections between individual phenotypes at that very direct level with these social phenotypes to try and kind of get a more causal picture of how something like, your social position would be inherited at an individual level.
Yeah, so we can only look at that for animals that stick around, and that means, that animals stick around longer. We know that so it's mostly females. So females get less social as they get older. They do differ. I can't remember if we fitted, maybe Adriana knows, if we ever fitted a random intercept, random slope model. I can't remember off the top of my head if we've looked at it that way yet, but that would be a logical thing to do, to sort of look at that individuality. No the short answer is it would be a smaller data set. We certainly could do that, but you'd have to sort of look at the subset of individuals that stick around, and that would get rid of a lot of the demographic variation as well, because some of these groups only have one adult female. Others are much more plastic. So one of the challenges, one of the things I've been trying to understand is the role of environmental and social factors influencing demography. We're sort of getting at those questions by these big data sets. But it's a good question. What was the second question? What was the follow-up?
I wondered whether you had plans in the future to try and relate the network metrics back to more localized, obviously individual phenotypes. Like you said, maybe motivational thresholds or other kind of more obviously individual phenotypes, which would be under selection rather than a social dimension.
We've done some work with that, and I'm spacing it right now.
Okay.
But we have done some work with that when we were trying to look for syndromes. And I can't remember the results, but there's something there.
All right, well, thank you.
Okay, so the next question comes from Leah Prox.
Hi, thanks for the very interesting talk. I'm Leah Prox from Peter Kappeler's lab at the German Primate Center in Göttingen, and I was wondering if you had any explanation for, so you said they were forcibly social, they didn't want to be social, right? And you see that in the decreased reproductive success of females and in longevity as well. And then on the other hand, the females which tend to stay in groups are the ones which are more embedded. And to my knowledge, embeddedness and degree should be correlated. So the females which actually have a higher degree, so which have lower prospects of being successful in this group, are deciding to stay. So how does that make, do you have any explanation for that?
Embeddedness looks at broader relationships and doesn't have to, you would have a higher, it's not just you have a higher degree, it's that you're connected to other groups. So that you have a higher degree, but also those groups are connected in ways, other individuals are connected in ways that make it harder for you to be isolated. So many of these things are correlated. That's the challenge with social network stuff, getting a clean beat on this. But females that are more embedded are less likely to disperse, you know, after controlling for other variables that might explain variation in dispersal. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I guess, okay.
Okay, so the next comes from, looks like we have some questions from YouTube. Miles.
Hi, thank you for the great talk. My name is Miles Machinsky. I'm a master's student in Lauren Hayes' lab at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga. And like he said, I have some questions to relay from YouTube from two different individuals. The first comes from Gisela Sobral, who I believe is from Brazil. And they said, first, a compliment, which is loving every second of this talk, and then asks two questions. The first one is, as for the parasites, have you looked at correlations with testosterone levels, since males usually have a higher parasitic load? And then the second question is, what are the observations for the popularity principal component analysis, and are those daily social network analyses metrics, are they daily or monthly, is what the question is.
Yeah, okay, so the first one is testosterone. We have an assay for testosterone. Lauren said that I have lots of grant support. I have like 0 grant support. This is cobbled along on the goodwill of many, many people who volunteer. So I don't have money to do testosterone assays. They're a little more expensive. However, we're looking at court-related assays and male dominance and other things now, and we'll have some results sooner rather than later on that. With respect to how the networks are calculated, I'm sorry, I wasn't clear. These are not primates. They are not interacting much. We use basically, you know, a whole season of interactions. It would be really great to sort of do weekly or monthly interactions. Our networks are so sparse that you get different results if you look at subsets of the data. And I think the most robust numbers come from looking at, you know, the whole season of interactions. Now, the interesting thing is they're pretty social when they emerge, and by the time they disperse, there's not a lot of social interactions anymore, except between the pups, which are different questions and different data sets, and often because of vegetation, we can't really see them. So it sort of depends. So most of our social interactions are happening in April, May, and June. And I just don't feel comfortable looking at time series type analyses because the networks are sparse to begin with. So that's a constraint of studying less social animals, and we had discussions about the value of studying less social species. This is the challenge of studying less social species. Your data kind of suck.
Okay, thank you on Gisela's behalf. And then and first, again, starts off with a compliment, says nice talk, and then asks, have you seen marmots trying to exclude others from joining those cohorts experiencing the benefits from sociality?
So first of all, when we work at, depending upon how you look at it, 11 or 13 different colony sites in a 5-kilometer section of the valley. Very few animals are observed dispersing from one colony site to another. Of those, it's a little more common for males than females. Most of our dispersers leave our 5-kilometer section of our valley and are lost. There are some immigrants. Female matrilines can, the way Ken Armitage thinks about yellow-bellied marmots and has thought for years, is really focusing on this matriline. Female matrilines don't let other individuals join them pretty much. That just doesn't happen. Every once in a while, someone can carve out a space nearby, but they're really not interacting with those same individuals. So no, we don't really see individuals joining groups. Almost all of the recruitment happens through daughters being permitted to stick around in a group. And this varies widely. In bigger habitat patches, they can be bigger, but then you get some psycho female that, you know, chases all her daughters away, bites off their tails, bites their hind feet. You know, I mean, we've seen that. You know, and for an epic, you know, as long as we have this one psycho female chasing all her daughters away, we have like one breeding female or maybe two breeding females in this colony site. As soon as she dies, suddenly everyone's breeding and everyone's sticking around. So the benefit of this is we have a lot of variability at the population level that allows us to study these processes. But they don't really let other animals join their groups.
Thank you on Claudia's behalf.
Okay, so the next question comes from David Wood.
Hi, thanks for a very interesting talk. I'm David Wood. I'm a second-year PhD student of Eduardo's at Yale, and I am very interested in what goes on in the burrows. It makes a lot of sense to me that these rodents would kind of have a lot on their mind and a lot to keep track of when they're above ground. They got to eat, they have to make sure that they aren't eaten. So I'm wondering if you've done any research into any sorts of interactions within the burrows. Do they share the burrows? Do they share them, you know, with the similar individuals that they are closely, you know, relating to above ground? Do they huddle when they hibernate? Have you done anything inside the burrows?
Short answer is we can see who comes out of hibernacula, and we know that unlike the more the more obligately social species of marmots, where the some of which, at least alpine marmots in the Alps, behavioral thermoregulation, group thermoregulation is essential for juvenile survival. Adult males can hibernate alone. Adult females can hibernate alone. Mothers typically hibernate with their kids, but kids can make it through without their mom. Males sometimes hibernate with their wife, their main wife. Maybe they don't. We sort of see everything in that respect in terms of animals coming out of burrows. During the summer, individuals share burrows. They can go away, they can sleep alone, they don't have to. I've tried to develop robots with engineers to go down burrows. I failed at that. I forgot this summer we were delayed in going out, but now I sort of have a professional colonoscopy tube for plumbers that I need to put in the burrow and try to look and see what's going on. But what's really interesting about these burrows is that, oh my God, I mean, imagine a dump truck filled with cinder blocks. Imagine dumping that and then putting soil over it. You know, our robots that we were only able to get in so far, that's what these things have. Marmots are rodents. Rodents can get through anything their head has. I mean, marmots have pretty big bellies at times, but you know, I think they can squeeze themselves through like toothpaste or something. And that's really interesting because when a tragedy happens, when a badger discovers a marmot colony, the badgers like kill everybody. And it really happens pretty quickly, or it can happen pretty quickly. But the marmots in these really rocky burrows are able to survive the badger onslaughts. And so I think that makes it sort of difficult to know what's going on. For years, I was writing proposals to put temperature data loggers in marmots, and I never got funded. You know, that would be really interesting to sort of look at that. We borrowed animals from the field and hibernated them in Kansas when I was postdocing with Ken years ago, and you know, hibernated them alone, hibernated them together. You know, if together, they would ball up. However, the most interesting thing we discovered is that you can't, I mean, so we like our animals, right? We try not to hurt them. You know, we borrowed them to hibernate them and then we brought them back. You know, we don't want to change the population dynamics with manipulations. So we have these animals and we're completely freaked out. It's like, you know, you put data loggers in them to look at their temperature and surgically, and they recover from that. And then it's like, okay, here's the crux. We're gonna have to turn off the lights and turn down the temperature. You know, that's insane. You know, you don't turn off the lights and turn down the temperature and put your animals in the freezer. So that's what we're kind of doing. So we're like turning off the lights and turning down the temperature, and they're not hibernating. And we're like, what's going on? What's going on? And Ken had this insight one day. He's like, maybe they need bedding material. I'm like, cool. And he goes and he just sort of goes into the walk-in freezer and gives them brown paper towels. boom, they're all hibernating the next night. Curled up. Hibernating marmot is so cool. It is a hairy stone. It's cold and fuzzy, and you have this ball of piloerect hair, but it's cold. It's the weirdest thing ever. So we know something, about that from captivity. It will be fascinating to do more stuff underground. And they say things to each other. I've studied a lot of the alarm calls because those are loud vocalizations that you can hear and record, but they grumble and mumble and make all sorts of other calls. My students have been, go to our Instagram site, and you can sort of see some marmots saying things, but they've been sort of filming with their phones, marmots in town where we can get really close to them and hear and see interactions. And you see amazing stuff when you're very close to them. So there's clearly more complex stuff going on in these guys, and a lot of it's going on underground. Every once in a while, you might see the wrong animal be chased into a burrow because there's a predator around, and then you sort of hear fur flying, and then someone comes back out. Typically we're missing all of that, which is unfortunate, but there you have it. They have an address, so they're not flying around.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, as someone who studies another social rodent, I appreciate that. I have no idea what's going on underground with the daggers. We have ideas, but not clear, obviously. So the next question is Aaron Sandel.
Thanks again for the talk. It was really fascinating. I study chimpanzees. I'm at UT Austin, and so I have a bit of a primate focus, but I have two questions. One is, it's fascinating talking about the cost of being social, the cost of being connected. And I think we assume that aggression is sort of negative, grooming is affiliative, but I wonder for marmots, is grooming or proximity, are these necessarily friendly behaviors, or might it actually be?
Yeah, great question. Grooming, I think, is friendly. However, we did a study where we looked at pups and yearlings and adults, and we were looking at sort of playful interactions. And pups and yearlings can play quite a bit. And we said, okay, well, let's look at the outcome of play. So in any social interaction, someone approaches someone, and at some point, someone's going to move away. Let's score those displacements as the loser of a play bout. Now, play is defined as, apparently functionless behavior that is reciprocal, and, animals change roles and engage in behaviors from other contexts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Let's look at play dominance, and then let's look at dominance a year later. Pup play dominance was associated with yearling dominance. Pup play dominance was more weakly associated with adult dominance for animals that stuck around. So play is sort of a way to sort out dominance relationships. Having said that, animals look like they're having fun when they're playing. Grooming, there's not a lot of grooming. There's some grooming, between mothers and kids, and sometimes sisters and siblings. Sometimes you have the nice father who goes and grooms his kids. These are not primates. We have to watch, on average, if you look across, the 1,000 or so hours of observations a year, we see a social observation, every 4 hours. It's more concentrated during the time when they're engaged in social observations, but these are not that social, which is a challenge and depressing, but the data are what the data are. I mean, the advantage is we know who's in the group. We know spatially who can live there. We're not playing the gambit of the group, which many people who study social interactions have to play because they don't know who the groups are. Not primatologists know who the groups are. But
right. I think also even with chimps, I'm beginning to doubt whether all grooming is affiliative and whether it could be, serving some other function. But sort of related to that and related to your multiple studies coming together, you're identifying these links among various social variables like group cohesion, embeddedness. I think that's a cool measure, and social relationship stress. I was wondering if your multiple lines of evidence can inform group fissions, thinking more broadly across mammals. I'm thinking specifically sort of with primates, but can you can you start developing sort of a theory for why groups might permanently fission? And could you even start predicting it based on marmots as a model?
No, not marmots as a model, but I think that approach could be used in the right systems to ask that question. I think it would be a very good one to ask. Marmots aren't a model for that because matriline's may go extinct. Ken has these amazing diagrams in various papers and book chapters where you sort of follow a matriline, over years, and you have some matrilines persisting for 20 years, and some are, shorter. But the matrilines don't really fission in the same way. The groups don't fission. There's a geography here. Having said that, when we really had our population boom and the population went up from 30 to 60 animals to 350 animals, we had animals not going to necessarily to re-inhabit extinct locations, because we had a whole bunch of extinct locations at the time, but rather digging new burrows in the general area and sort of moving over there. And they weren't really interacting with their mothers. So is that a fission or is that sort of a near dispersal? I don't know. And it's a little more complex, but the sort of fission fusion society literature pattern seen in nature, I don't think this is a good system for studying that, but I think the tools are good tools to potentially maybe gain some novel insights into the sorts of relationships that underlie that and the dynamics of what happens. I mean, I think, classic work by Jessica Flack, what happens when your, dominant male disappears, what happens to the group, how do they survive, how does policing work, et cetera. I think those are really interesting questions that are appropriately asked with various social network statistics.
Okay, so the next question comes from Zulema, please.
Yeah. Hi, Dan.
Hi.
I'm, for other people, I'm Zulema Tang Martinez from the University of Missouri in St. Louis. And Dan, I have to say that watching your talk brought back memories about the delightful visit that we paid you unexpectedly at Rumble several years ago.
I wish you were there longer. That was fun.
Yeah, it was so much fun. Anyway, I have a couple of questions, and Lauren, you can ignore my second question mark because that was a mistake, which is further down right before Nancy. My first question relates to what Jordan asked earlier, and you may already have answered it. I wasn't sure. I was thinking that you have all of these different characteristics and measures, and I wonder if you look at the sum total of all of the measures that you have, you are seeing any evidence of behavioral syndromes, and I won't call them personalities, but behavioral syndromes where you have clusters of traits that go together for particular, individuals. That was one question.
Yes, the short answer. And we've written about that as well. And some of them involve these social traits, but we don't always see syndrome structure. So syndromes, to properly do syndromes, you have to show individuality in behaviors. You have to be repeatable in individuals. And then syndromes are correlations across repeatable traits. So we do have some syndromes.
Okay. And then maybe you could say a little bit about that. But the other question that I have is, with this issue of females that are more embedded, if you want, to have greater social attachments, being less likely to disperse, I guess what I'm wondering is that, given that, as I understand it, in the marmots, there are very low levels of aggression to begin with, and there are also few females that disperse. If you think that that relationship that you found is really robust from a, I guess another way of saying it is from a biologically meaningful perspective.
Yeah, I would say that the females are not typically not tearing fur out of each other. But there are female dominance hierarchies, and every once in a while you see some real aggression. But it was when we really started looking at the simple displacements that we could begin thinking about rank, and we could begin seeing consequences of that. And I think, I'm not sure how big the effect size is, but I think, it is explaining things. And, over half the females eventually disperse, so there is a lot of dispersal. I think there are consequences of dominance. And I think that unitary explanations are not the way to understand things. It's not all about aggression. It's not all about dominance. But these are complex systems, and that interactions and thinking about socio-environmental interactions, I think, are the way we're going to get insights into these systems. And our effect sizes are often pretty small, but that doesn't mean they're not important.
Yeah. And so would you say that most of the effects that you're seeing are coming from displacements rather than from overt aggressive interactions?
Most of our aggression is from displacements, not a playful displacement, but I walk towards you and, then I walk away because you displaced me. That sort of displacement. Yes, rather than actual fights. So we don't have a lot of fur flying typically. We've had some recently. We can see it and hear it because they're animals in the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory Field Station, where you can get really close to them and see what's going on, both between males and females, and males and males and females and females. But there's most of it's pretty subtle stuff. But you sort of expect that chickens left to their own in your farmyard aren't having huge fights all the time. Once you get a hierarchy, you expect subtle stuff to be driving it, be the predominant sorts of interactions. Only when you have strife do you have more high-level, aggression.
Okay, great.
But I'll reiterate, the effect sizes of these things, I think, are typically pretty small. And I think that's important to understand, in general, thinking about many sorts of systems. Every once in a while, you sort of have something that has a huge effect. But, if we're looking for those huge effects, I don't know if looking for those huge effects is the way to go forward.
Thanks.
Okay, the next question comes from Linda Lonnie.
Okay, hi everyone, my name is Indira Magoya and I'm a recent master's graduate from the University of Pretoria, and I'm currently working with Carsten on the social evolution, mammalian social evolution. So one of the things we're doing now is trying to develop a PhD project where we're looking at the solitary living bush karoo rat. And one of the topics we were looking to explore was using social network analysis. So I guess my question to you then is, what would be your question or advice of using social network analysis to look at a solitary living species and comparing that with what you have done with the mammoths, which were more facultatively social, as compared to a strictly solitary animal or a strictly social animal, if that makes sense.
So I think it's really hard to study sociality and non-social animals. And, we're at the sort of low end of sociality, I think. I think that you're left to probably work with more remote measures like pit tags and pit tag readers or contact readers or things like that to get spatial networks. The way we just wrote up this paper we sent to Biology Letters, and it'll probably be rejected because everything is, is that Mark Bekoff said a number of years ago, you have to look at your animals. And, he's right. You have to look at your animals. And you see things when you look at your animals. We get different associations when we look at aggressive networks versus affiliative networks. Primatologists get different network structures if they look at grooming, versus co-sleeping networks. You need to be thinking very clearly about what these association matrices that you're getting mean, more broadly. But if you're dealing with something that's pretty asocial, you're probably not going to be looking at the social interactions as much as, spatial association networks. And that's fine. but you need to understand that you're looking at spatial association networks. For things like that, then there's a whole series of statistics that I think make a lot of sense, including these randomization statistics to sort of, if you're playing the gambit of the group, if you're defining groups based on contacts or spatial association, I actually think there's value for some of these randomization tests, but think very clearly about what you're randomizing and how you're randomizing. And I think there was just a paper in Animal Behavior that questions how people randomize and challenges, you know, the norm on node-based randomization or something like that. So be wise about going into thinking about how you're thinking about that. But you know, as a number of people have said already in this seminar series, we need to look at less social species to understand sociality. So it's really important to look at those less social species, but just we need to understand the constraints. Hardcore mathematical network people will say you can't compare two networks in the same species from different years for a variety of reasons. And they would also say you can't compare networks across species. I find that sort of a buzzkill. You know, maybe it's not perfect. It would be interesting to sort of see what we can get from that, recognizing that these are imperfect techniques. And I don't know if we're going to get perfect techniques, but you know, we need to understand, you know, relationships between less social species, because clearly they interact, and clearly these interactions may have consequences.
Okay, thank you so much.
Good luck with your work.
Thank you.
We have time for a couple more questions. The next is from Nancy Solomon.
Hi, Dan. Really interesting talk on so many levels. I think my question is the same one that Miles posted from Gisela to some extent. So have you used spatial associations? You keep talking about their address in any of the network analyses?
So depending upon what we're doing, we sometimes are defining the groups based on species overlap, burrow sharing. Other network analyses, we're just looking at the pattern of interactions. What you do when you get the spatial associations is burrow sharing, is that you sort of have, you constrain your size of who could interact, and then you find individuals that choose not to interact. So a lot of our analyses have done that, but not all of them. So it really depends on the question we're asking, you know, doing that. Nonetheless, this is not a school of guppies. I'm not trashing guppies. This is not a school of guppies where you put in a dip net and pull everyone out and say, "Oh, here's everyone together." You know, these are individuals that live in burrows and use burrows and share burrows, sometimes at the same time, sometimes at different times. And I think there is certainly room for more analyses where we look at these spatial associations in other sorts of ways. You know, we have unlimited analyses, and it's just a bandwidth problem. And I collaborate with a lot of people, which is fun, and I learn a lot from these collaborations.
So do they stay in the burrow system with the same individuals for the whole season?
Depends on the animals. You can hibernate in one area, and then sometimes animals, sisters, I think, typically, you know, might sort of interact with others. They might move around. They might change burrow systems, but in the same general area. We've had years like this year. We weren't there in the spring when they came out of hibernation, so we missed all of that. But there's been social disruption in one group for a couple of years, one area for a couple of years now. And it's been very clear to me what's going on in other years. And for a couple of years now, I have no idea what's going on. And we sort of have to run the numbers and see what's going on. But it's really weird. So some years and epochs are more understandable and predictable, structured. We've had lines of death before. I mean, literally where there's one group on this side of a meadow, another group on that side of the meadow, and maybe the male crosses when there's one male. And if there's two males defending the females, then no one crosses, and they get close to it, and everyone gets all puffy about that, and you sort of see them vectoring towards each other. So they know geography. But you know, we can look at burrow sharing. If you look at burrow sharing, what's really interesting is sometimes, you know, there's temporal burrow sharing, that you see animals using areas at one time of the day, but not the other time of the day, and other animals in the same, using the same burrows, using the same areas. So we haven't really looked at that in detail, but there's more nuance there. I mean, the challenge is a data challenge. They're not, our data sets suck. They're not that social, and you know, we do everything we can with it, and then we put everything in, and then we have our results, and then I look for patterns across results because I don't really believe in any single result.
Thank you. If nobody else has a question, I have one that's not about your data. When you were, when I met you, you were in Kansas with Ken. Was that a postdoc?
Yeah, that was an NIH postdoc.
No, I thought you were a PhD student there all these years.
No, I did my PhD with Judy Stamps at Davis. Ken accepted me. I didn't know I wanted to study marmots, and then I went to Judy. And then I used to get paid to bicycle around the world. And I was bicycling through, I was trying to bicycle around the Himalaya and Karakoram, but the Chinese stopped that. So I couldn't cross the border into China bicycling as an independent traveler at the time. So I ended up going back around and going to the Pakistan side. That was trying from India, and then I tried from Pakistan, and that didn't work either. And then stumbled on these marmots in Pakistan, which were really cool to study. And then decided I wanted to study marmots. Then Ken, you know, is such a mensch. You know, basically I said, hey, you know, I turned you down for grad school, and I never knew that I was going to study marmots, but can I come out and can you guys teach me how to marmoteer? It's like, sure, we need people studying more marmots. So he invited me out to Colorado, and I learned to marmoteer, and then I did my PhD, and I did a postdoc in Germany, and then I got an NIH postdoc for 3 years to work with him, which was great. And I did some work in Colorado and other work in other places, which was really fun. So.
Can I?
Go ahead, Eduardo, please. Go ahead,
Yes.
We'll do one more question from Eduardo.
Okay. This is a question you were describing to us, the absence of infanticide in the yellow-bellied marmots. As you probably know, among the primate literature, there are some people who would argue if it happens, it's because of what we say. If it doesn't happen, it's also because of what we say. It doesn't happen because now they have these wonderful evolved anti-infanticidal strategies. I was wondering, so your study clearly cannot, nobody could argue that there's not enough evidence of absence. So many times the issue in primatology is, well, there's absence of evidence. In your case, clearly what we have is lots of evidence of absence of infanticide. But you were saying that, but you did see it, your doctoral dissertation in Pakistan, if I remember well, you were saying about a fourth of an, so if you were to, what are the evolutionary explanations that you have, suggestions to explain the interspecific differences in the prevalence of infanticide in marmots?
I don't know.
That's a great answer.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't happen in yellow-bellieds. It's happened in captivity with yellow-bellieds, but it's just not, you know, you see a pattern. You know, we do have females lactating, and then we don't see the litter again. Every once in a while, we think it might be, you know, Ken's seen a female go into a burrow and then come out with a bloody face. Every once in a while, you know, but it's just not that, it's not that big a thing. And this is by females, not by infanticide by males. So I think if you're asking questions about infanticide, you have to break it down and say, you know, is this infanticide by males or is this infanticide by females? You know, prairie dogs, black-tailed prairie dogs do everything. I mean, they're horrid beasts. You know, females are going out and killing their sister's kids while their sister's going out and killing their kids. Now that doesn't seem like, you know, a good thing. There, I think there is more resource competition. Yellow-bellieds, I'm not sure where we're studying them. It's not obvious that there's resource limitation in some sense. Maybe that explains some of the variation. Maybe we need to look at higher elevation ones, but I didn't see infanticide by females, obviously, in Pakistan. I saw infanticide by males. So, you know, is that a resource limitation thing? It's not like, I mean, there females didn't breed every year. I mean, you know, there was a friend came up and visited me and said, these animals are terravores. I mean, where I study marmots in Colorado, there's 300 to 600 grams of above ground standing crop dry biomass per meter. In Pakistan, at the height of the growing season. And of course they have preferences, but nonetheless, the world is green. In Pakistan, we had 30 to 60 grams above ground standing crop at the height of the growing season. I mean, it was a high alpine desert. But the hypotheses about infanticide by males are all about getting females to breed more to sooner. Maybe, and females there didn't breed every year. Maybe, that drove it. I think, and alpine marmots don't necessarily breed every year either. And there's, infanticide by males. So I don't know. It's almost too small a group to ask the evolutionary questions. So yours in general, I think you can begin asking more sensible questions.
Thank you.
All right, well, I don't see any more questions in the queue, and I think, Dan's done a great job at having questions there. I do have one more coming in from YouTube. Dan, can you take one more?
Sure.
Okay. Okay, so I'm seeing a message that it was about spatial, I think you already answered, it was about spatial associations. So I think we're good.
I have a comment.
Go ahead, Sulema,
This is
please.
Sulema. I have to say that having worked on black-tailed prairie dogs, I have always been extremely skeptical about the whole issue of female infanticide in prairie dogs. I just wanted to throw that out, a dissenting opinion.
Okay. I just read the literature. I haven't studied them myself.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that.
I would say you can't believe anything you read, so.
And thanks, Dan, for a really, really good talk.
Thanks for
Did
coming,
it
guys.
in the population difference, Sulema? In the black tails?
I'm not sure. I mean, at the time, and I'm assuming, Dan, that